My name is Michael Knox. My job is to introduce Jagdish Bhagwati, who will speak to us today. Jagdish Bhagwati is a professor at Columbia and a senior fellow in international economics at the Council of Foreign Relations. To say he's a preeminent economist in his field probably underrates his achievement. This year we have seen something different. The Economic Society of Australia has been holding its Eminent Speaker Series in different parts of Australia using the same leading speakers who address the Australian Conference of Economists. The result for people like me, who regularly attend the National Australian Conference of Economists and the New South Wales branch's Australian Economic Forum, and then follow the state presentations by the eminent speakers, is that it's rather like attending a series of Test cricket matches. I get to see the speakers and the Eminent Speaker Series play a different innings in each location. Jagdish Bhagwati's speech, which was supposed to be on international trade, he tells me, but really was on international relations, which he gave at Federation Square in Melbourne 2 weeks ago, was like a master batsman making 105 to put his team in a winning position at stumps on the first day. I learnt more from listening to him than I could by years of reading the best newspapers. He referred to one international conference on climate in Mexico as Cancun Light, saying that at least the participants had agreed to keep talking to each other. He said that Cancun Light and decaf would have meant that it was only water. His presentation at the Australian Economic Forum on the Indian economy on Friday morning was like a quick 50 before lunch. He closed with a wonderful winning line that the noise of open government was the music of democracy. I do not know how he was going to play this presentation. However, listen closely. You may hear the sound of a ball being hit out of the park.
Thank you for those lovely remarks. I know that one can hit a sixer or one can actually go out for a zero. I hope it'll be the former, or at least close to the former. We have been running around like roving troubadours, singing in different places. And I do know that some of you may have heard me, certainly Mr. Chairman has heard me already in Melbourne, but you'll forgive me in case I repeat something inadvertently, because by now I'm totally confused as to what I've said where. But I thought the appropriate thing to do is to talk about trade, because that happens to be my comparative advantage, and I hope also my absolute advantage. And it's also appropriate because one has learned so much from Australian economists actually on international trade. It is interesting because the two countries which have really done a lot on international trade, one is Canada, and I could go through a similar description of people there, but certainly in Australia we've learned a lot from policy economists like Ross Garnaut and Peter Drysdale and so on, but also from theorists like Max Gordon, Murray Kemp. You can take a whole variety of people and you have there. So it seems to be appropriate, like bringing coal to Newcastle, or as they used to say in Old English, teaching your grandmother how to suck eggs, which I always wondered about, because in our days where we are aware of cholesterol, it sounds like a prescription for euthanasia. But anyway, so let me just talk about two things which I think are very much on at the top of people's concerns. One, of course, is the demise of the Doha round. And there I want to point a finger, actually, at the United States, much as I voted with my feet and still live there. And I do believe in traditionally, the United States did provide leadership, and now it's been sadly lacking. I mean, once I was at a meeting where there was Pascal Lamy, Director General of WTO, Baroness Ashton, and me, and they were talking about, because Doha was already beginning to flounder, and so the two of them were refusing to point a finger at anybody. They're being extremely diplomatic, like you've been, Mr. Chairman, for a while. Not anymore, I notice. And then, so it came to my turn, and the Master of Ceremonies sort of turned to me and said, Professor Bhagwati, would you like to point a finger at somebody, you know, and for failure of Doha? I said, it depends on which finger you ask me to use. It was just a silly remark, but I became the hero of the hour. After that, I could say nothing which would create any difficulties for me. So I'm going to point a finger, not because I like to point fingers, but because I do think if you don't point fingers, if you don't try and diagnose what went wrong and from where, you're not going to be able to say anything meaningful. So that's one part. And the other part, of course, concerns Australia more directly. It's true that your Prime Minister was among the people who tried to save Doha. I mean, certainly. There were lots of statesmen around the world, not just scholars like me and so on, who were pushing for Doha to be concluded. So Australia had a little stake in the system in terms of saying, let us keep the multilateral trading system going. But now you're in the middle of something else, which is a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think is a double disaster. To kill Doha is bad enough, but to start TPP, I think is an additional damage to the trade. But I want to explain exactly why I think so. And I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. So I'll divide it into two parts very quickly. The Doha part is fairly straightforward. I think the President of the United States, President Obama, at one level one can sympathize with him, because when he came in, he had two problems. One was a sin of omission, as it were, or rather, let me put a sin of commission on the part of George W. Bush, because he did not really collect the monies to be able to pay for the war. And I don't think it was ideological. I think it was just the sort of thing that happens when you when you make the wrong assumptions about what's going to happen. When he went into the Second Iraq War, which which we are still kind of still mired in a little bit, he was going by the experience of the First Iraq War. Because at that time, I'm a Democrat, and all the Democrats that voted against that war think it would go on forever and ever. And it was over in, 3 weeks or something? And that was the mindset of all the Democrats. And when it came to the Second Iraq War, they wanted to correct the old mistake. So they voted, all of them, including Hillary Clinton and so on, for the new war. And, of course, President Bush had never done an exercise of alternative scenarios, and he just assumed this would last 3 weeks. Well, it didn't last 3 weeks, as we know. If it had lasted for 3 weeks, then he had taken all the budgetary expenditures off the budget, not in the regular budget, because he thought it would just disappear in no time. A little stimulus wouldn't be bad for the economy. And then, of course, once you got hold of Iraq, you could just turn on the spigot and get the oil flowing. U.S. basically is a net importer, so that'd be another good thing for the United States. Both those assumptions went haywire, all right? And therefore, they came a cropper. And it had nothing to do with ideology, in my judgment. It's part of the random errors which plague governments, because the world is full of surprises. But the effect was that the President Obama inherits that situation of a very bad, budget situation, fiscal situation, and his maneuverability in terms of, even if he could get the Republicans to go with him, of spending more by the fiscal stimulus is strictly limited, all right? Because every time he tries to do that, the Republicans say, we already have a high, we've got to worry about the fiscal situation, and we can't afford to spend more. But at the same time, I think he inherited a situation on trade, which was actually a sin of omission, I would say, by President Clinton. Because President Clinton, in the first year that he came in, 92, first time I voted because I changed my nationality. You can't vote in India from abroad, and you can't vote if you don't have if you're not a citizen in the United States, though you can if you really try hard enough, as you know. But I wanted to do it legally, so that was my first vote for President Clinton in those days. And President Clinton, in the first year, was extremely skeptical and tentative about trade because he had come in on the basis of worries in the Silicon Valley about competing with Japan and Korea on semiconductors and IT sector. So he used to talk from both sides of his mouth, you know. One side he was pro-trade, on the other side he was anti-trade. So I used to say that if President Bush Sr. said, you know, read my lips, the problem with President Clinton was, which you didn't know whether to read his upper lip or his lower lip. But after 1 year, he found religion. I mean, you know, hate to call free trade religion, it's a rational, secular doctrine. but that was what he found. And then he fought like a tiger for it. And you remember he brought Daley over to help him and so on. And he just won by the skin of his teeth. But he fought like hell. And the unions were dead set against it. So he vanquished the unions, but he didn't convert them. Right? So they just disappeared from the scene altogether, you know, slinking away, but still biding their time. And by the time President Obama comes in, the unions had made a comeback, a political comeback. Large numbers of Democrats were elected with union money and unions ringing the bells and, you know, getting the vote out. And a few others on their own were, in fact, against trade. So what President Obama was unfortunately presented with was that he had to face the unions, which were still militant like they were under President Clinton's time. And nobody had gotten, I mean, Paul Krugman, my student, was on my side at that time, you know, because now he's religiously pro-democratic. And, you know, I tend to tell it the way it is, including against my own party. But we were all, you know, pointing out that, in fact, the union's fear of trade was unjustified. So President Clinton could have brought us all together. Any economist of his choice, 95% of economists and academics happen to be Democrats as it happened, right? Much as we deny it, that's a fact. You know, it's highly unbalanced. Since I'm not a Republican, I don't shed any tears over this fact. So that is where he could have really put us down and said, look, take any 5 economists of his choice. He doesn't like Bhagwati, he doesn't like Krugman, forget it. There are plenty of others, fish in the ocean. But he never did that. He just really eliminated them as a political force, only for the time being. And he's such a brilliant person to be able to argue. He could have done it. So poor Obama inherits you know, a bunch of people who have come back and who are really smarting to reverse the fate over NAFTA and the other way around. So that's something that the president has no time for it. I mean, how many things can he handle? He's got the fiscal policy to worry about, and he started the medical health care problem. His hands are full. So I have a sympathy for him, but it's something which he could not do. But then it was the business lobbies also which finally gave way, and that's something which I think is peculiar to the United States. I mean, you do need the lobbies, business lobbies, and there are many businessmen here. You need that in order to drive, you know, the politics in favor of opening markets and so on. But the American lobbies are extremely tough-minded, unlike the European ones. If you look at on the Doha round, the International Chamber of Commerce, which is largely run by non-Americans, it has always been in favor of closing the Doha round, saying, let's settle it and move on to unfinished agenda later. But you take the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, etc., they want every pound of flesh. And they would tell the president, there's not enough in the system, enough negotiated for us to close the round. The notion that you close it and then go on to unfinished agenda, like we did with the Uruguay round, where of course everything which we asked for was not there. In fact, a lot was not there. And you're basically agricultural exporting country traditionally, and you know that we started out with a zero option, meaning all tariffs, subsidies, everything to be removed, and we have a pure market, a dream, right? An Australian dream probably as well. And we settled for almost nothing, just converting the tariffs and quotas into equivalent protection. And then our idea was that we would then take steps then to reduce it in the next round. So we were quite sensible about that and so on. And that same thing could have been done. But the lobbies in Washington said, no way. And I think, as Mr. Chairman said, this is known as Doha Light, which had been negotiated, which could have been, augmented with marginal changes. We could have settled it and gone on to maybe an Obama round or something like that to do the unfinished agenda. But Washington wanted, the lobbies wanted Doha heavy, meaning a lot more concessions from the rest of the world, which meant negotiating another 5 years beyond the existing 10 years, which means as good as dead, Doha dying. So I think it was the excessive demands of the lobbies which I think was part of the problem. And again, to be sympathetic to the president had a hostile, trade hostile, all right, or at best trade skeptical union movement, which is part of his constituency. And then he had labor support, the business supports practically zilch. So if he had gone in for Doha, and here I'm giving the best case for him, he would have been like a general without any troops, right? You can't. I mean, in a democracy, how can he? He can't just lay down the law, particularly not in an American democracy where constituencies matter, all these groups matter. So I think that was the best case you could make, but I think there was something there. The president was in. But he had more degrees of freedom, in my view, than he really let out. He was playing risk averse, and that's because of the fiscal situation in particular. I think he never really bought into the notion that trade could be helpful, even under circumstances where the unemployment situation was considerable. And I think he was buying two particular arguments, which I think I might just put out. One was he could have brought the unions on board despite the fiscal situation, despite the unemployment, by saying that in fact the reason for your distress is not international trade, that international trade actually helps you. Now that's a rather radical position to take, but there are two narratives on board. One is that when you trade with poor countries, in particular with labor-abundant countries, trade with poor countries produces poor in the rich countries. So this is a kind of present-day version of the Marxist version of the immiseration of the proletariat Marx is striking through international trade. If that is so, you're going to be afraid, okay? And there are models in economics for everything, and you can actually produce an argument along these lines. But the other narrative is that we've lost a lot of labor-intensive goods anyway. There are very few extremely labor-intensive products being made, and in fact you have essentially the poor people are not going to be made more poor through trade, but in fact whatever incomes they earn, they're going to have to spend, and their real wages as against the nominal wages depend on being able to buy goods more cheaply, and most of them buy that, essentially flip-flops and, lingerie in what we call Filene's basement, deep down at very low rates, because the women in the working class, they don't go and buy lingerie in Victoria's Secret, which I sometimes say is no more because she's revealed it all. So you therefore, when you look at even the tariff structure, it is very much in protecting against the cheap imports, and it lets off the guys at the top with more advanced, more sophisticated goods, simply because the more sophisticated people, just a side remark, they compete. Like Giorgio Armani competes with Calvin Klein and so on and so forth. These guys are into little niche markets and developing know-how. They don't go to the governments and ask for protection. But when you're faced with the elastic supply of textiles or something, then you scream and then go and ask for protection. So that's an interesting argument in political economy as well. So I think my view, for what it's worth, and it's worth a lot because lots of people share it, is that really the trade is actually helping the poor, not harming them. Now, this is something the president could have really taken to the political system. He could have brought in John Sweeney, all the AFL-CIO people, trashed it out, right? Because that's what an informed democracy is about, and that's what leadership is about. But he never did that, unfortunately. So he just accepted the dark, hostile view of the unions. And the other thing was that he really, I think, was influenced by much as, I think Krugman is a fantastic economist, and I'm very proud of having discovered him at MIT way back. He was the one I picked out and supported. And then when he wasn't being published, he used to come and cry on my shoulders, no more. No more. He's just unbelievably good. He actually sometimes produces arguments which I think leave a little something to be desired because they're always logical, but the premise is not particularly interesting or relevant. So he has an argument which I know has been influential in the US government, which is simply that if we have inadequate world demand, which I think we Keynesians usually buy into now, and if you use a trade policy or trade barrier to shift the given inadequate world demand to your own goods, right, by using a tariff or a trade barrier, then that is, in fact, going to increase your employment. Right? My great teacher, Joan Robinson, pointed out that this would amount to a beggar my neighbor policy because the other guy could do the same thing to me if I start playing this game. Therefore, we will, as a result, wind up with more tariffs and no real solution because aggregate demand hasn't really increased. So Keynes actually gave way, having first started this protectionist argument. He was a great convert to protectionism in 1930, I think, right after 1929 crash. And then people sort of got away from that and said, these are beggar my neighbor policies. Now, Paul has an interesting variation, and he says, and this was quite influential, as I said, that we want other people to increase aggregate demand, but they won't do it, like China and Germany, which don't believe in this Keynesian solution to begin with. All right? So they have a different view, but our view is that they ought to be doing more, and they're not doing more. So we are going to have to do more ourselves, right? Fairly logical. Now, if we are spending more money, it's perfectly legitimate to use trade barriers to make sure we get the maximum bang out of it for our own employment. So we should be able to use trade barriers. Well, logically correct, as always with Paul Krugman, but the other countries are not going to look at our trade policy as being justified by this argument. As soon as you do a trade barrier, immediately others retaliate. And that is true if you, that's another story. The Chinese immediately retaliate. When we had Buy America policy, the the Canadians retaliate. Everywhere there is retaliation in the game, therefore you wind up supporting protectionism. Even there's a subtle variation on beggar my neighbor policy. I think that had a big influence, I'm told, because there are not many economists in the administration. Most of it is run by lawyers of one kind or another. And so I think that may have played a major role. Anyway, we lost Doha because the president just gave up on it. I mean, your prime minister, Angela Merkel, Cameron, God knows how many statesmen around the world said, we have to settle. It's 10 years now, and it's as good as dead if we don't do it now. And lots of us, scholars wrote, sometimes we have a role, but most of the time we would be ignored, when people have strong political views. And so I think it was allowed to die in the end. I think I and Peter Sutherland were co-chairs of a commission appointed by Angela Merkel and Matt Cameron, etc. So we went up to Davos about 2 years ago, and we had a session, and they were all there, all these, including Yo-Yo Tiono and so on, and Pascal Lamy. When it came to my turn, I saw John Kerry sitting there. He's the main man in the Senate for the president. And I just said that maybe the best or the most pleasing interpretation we can put on why the president was unwilling now even to mention Doha, because he had completely eliminated all references to Doha in the preceding 18 months. And I said the most pleasing one, most agreeable interpretation was that he was upset about the state of, the acrimonious state of political discourse, and wanted to bring civility to it. So he didn't want to utter a four-letter word like Doha. So everybody laughed, except John Kerry, and I knew that was it. I mean, being married to a Russian economist, I tried to learn from signals, not from hard logic. And I said that was it, and it was it. The president actually instructed our man, putting on my American hat, in Geneva, not to accept anything at all. Poor Pascal Lamy tried to rescue what you remembered as, he said, not Doha heavy, nor Doha light, but Doha light and decaf, which I said was nothing else but colored water. And there, only one thing was demanded really of any importance, was that that we in America had offered to the least developed countries, about 49 of them, a one-way free entry like the Europeans do. And the Americans wouldn't give even that, saying that was part of the overall framework in which Doha heavy would have to be negotiated. So literally, poor Pascal Lamy was left twisting in the wind. And nobody could get anything done by the United States. So I think that's one story, and I think it's unfortunate. But now let me just, on TPP, and then finish in 5 minutes. The TPP, I mean, economists who are sensible, meaning like me, we don't just take the first best, because in the real world there are so many constraints and politicians can't do exactly what you suggest. So, okay, multilateral negotiations are gone. But so now we want to do bilaterals and regionals, okay? Now that has been going on for some time now, even before Doha died. And the United States wanted to go south, because that is a sphere of influence, traditional. It's backyard, as we say in politics, right? So they wanted to do a free trade agreement of the Americas. There were other reasons why, Baker, etc., pushed into that. But some of us pointed out that if you really wanted to go regional, that was not the region you wanted to go. The region you wanted to go was right here in Asia, which is a dynamic region, okay? So if you want trade, if you want to benefit from that, go east, right, rather than south. Of course, the Americans were, grew by going west, as you know. So maybe going east was rather contrary to the internal DNA as developed through the expansion of the United States. But certainly going south didn't make any sense. But they went south. So then what did people in your region, and by that I mean Mahathir, who was the Malaysian Prime Minister, I'm sure you know him better than I do, and he said, if you're going to keep us out of your region, we're going to keep you out of ours. So ASEAN plus 1, ASEAN plus 3, none of them had the United States. So the Americans were biting their fingernails. How the hell do we get in here? So they try and cultivate New Zealand, Japan, maybe Australia, I don't know. But, it's not sufficient. And ultimately, they got their way with TPP purely because China became an aggressive nation. In East China Sea, South China Sea, around India, we've got what we call a string of pearls that's surrounding India. So India, which did not want to do what George W. wanted them to do, which is to team up with Japan and contain China, we had no interest in trying to contain China. It's more easily said than done. It's a giant, right? So we didn't want to get involved. Now we're actually worried about it. And you even have, 500 Marines? My daughter was a Marine Corps captain, so she could have been getting a free trip to Australia on that one. But 500 Marines in Darwin. So that's a sort of step in the, in the door. But the whole region is worried now. And some years ago, I had discussed with Lee Kuan Yew. I'd been taken to see him several years ago. And I said, why are you wanting to be doing an FTA with the United States? I kind of vaguely knew what he might say, but he did say more or less. He said, during the Second World War, the Japanese were wicked as hell, again, in our whole region. So we have to worry about them. Chinese are communists. They will be wicked when the time is ripe. And that is true. That's a phrase that typically used. You bide your time and then give a whack as necessary, okay? So that's the communist way. It's what we call in economics a results-oriented strategy. Sounds much nicer. And so he said, we will do anything within reason to have the United States in the region, right? That's a political statement. Now, that same argument, because Singapore is one of the leaders in the TPP, one of the early four, and China is already breathing down their neck. We just passed through there, and the diplomats were saying Chinese were trying to bamboozle about TPP because that's a little country, relatively speaking. Vietnam would be an even easier one, but doesn't have the same influence as Singapore does. So the idea was to use the current situation, which is one of great threat from China, to try and revive essentially the Lee Kuan Yew approach. And that's what TPP is, essentially, that it has enabled the Americans to get back into the region. Now, I would just, one thought, and I'll leave it there, because the trouble is, fine, this is the way regionals and bilaterals move. Politics is important, okay? It doesn't go because somebody says, this is a wonderful opportunity for trade. It usually goes the other way. You say, this is politics, we ought to be with our allies or friends or satellites, and we then work up a case. You can always hire a think tank to do it for you, that it's really going to be great for your trade as well. So the trade is subsidiary in many cases, and if you look at the current the current FTAs which the US has signed, Korea is clearly a security case rather than trade, in my opinion, because Korea, South Korea, North Korea, as you would expect, is to its north. Then they've got China and they've got Japan. They want the US to be there, right, for security reasons. Same thing for Colombia. They've got a big security problem with their cartels, drug cartels and so on. So that's another security area concern. And Panama is the only other one they've signed. But I doubt if anyone knows in the United States where Panama is. It's not a relevant FTA. It just went along with the package. So that's about it so far. And the TPP is a major initiative right now. And I think that is where you have the politics, but you also have the US lobbies. They haven't disappeared, they're part of the show. And I think that's where the literally dozens and dozens of lobbies which are at work. And they use euphemisms like, this is a trade agreement, with all these different things they've shoved into a trade agreement, and saying that's a trade agreement for the 21st century. And I say, why did you make it even better sounding and call it the trade agreement for the 22nd, and then we'll be rid of you for the current one, right? And it will sound grand. And they say this is the most advanced agreement, and so on and so forth. But those are words. Essentially, a whole lot of things are being put in, which actually, if you start looking at them, you're going to worry about. So my advice, it will all come out in due course. And the American strategy was very clear. They went with Brunei and with Singapore and New Zealand and Vietnam, relatively small countries. I mean, not as bad as Brunei, but still relatively small. And then they're going on after that to Japan, Canada. They were not brought into the actual drafting of the template, precisely because they would raise objections. Even Australia, I'm told, will be raising objections to an excessive pitching of information technology, of IP protection, because the American lobbyists, as I said, lobbies are good, but these are going too far. So they ask for WTO plus protection. If they say WTO minus, you'd think a little bit, right? But WTO plus, how can you be against a plus sign? Unless you put a multiplication sign, I don't know. But plus, it sounds good. But that is where I know from having discussed it in Canberra that the approach is maximal protection, and assuming that that is equivalent to optimal protection. And we do know, from economics and from law as well, that you can have too much protection because, you have to reward people with monopoly returns on what they invent, because it doesn't drop like manna from heaven. On the other hand, if you have too much of it, people can't stand on your shoulders and do some more. It's very elementary economics, but the lobby is so strong, and U.S. worry about getting returns from IP so strong that they're pushing at as far out as possible. So that's just to give you an example of something which in principle sounds good, but you have to look at it in the mouth. So there are lots of those things which you actually, probably about 4 to 5 dozen different lobbies have been shoving in things. So that is going to make it very difficult to have India and China come in, because India doesn't want these additional things. It considers them to be matters which should be negotiated elsewhere or in self-standing treaties like Kyoto and so on for environment. And China, of course, cannot meet labor standards and things like that in the nature of the case, because it's a totalitarian country virtually, right? It cannot sign on to these things. India prefers not to. So India has just sent back to EU an FTA proposal saying strip it of everything that is not directly trade, and we'll, it's not that we want to pull out the fingernails of trade union leaders and torture them and so on. It's just that we don't think that should be part of a trade treaty. So that's already gone back. So now what worries me is that if all of these so-called features, great features, the best trade agreement of this century, if they're put in there, it is not going to be possible for the two big countries of Asia to be part of the TPP. Now, I don't, and particularly on China for your country, Australia, it seems to me that this then automatically creates a divider between China and between US. And nobody in their right minds in this region would want that kind of. So one way to get out of this box, which is to some extent fortuitous, the politics of TPP, of starting TPPs is I explained to you why that is, but the fact that all these lobbies have moved in is something which is somewhat separate, okay? So the two together then present the dilemma which I was pointing out, that you're in danger of dividing region, Asian region, forget about the Pacific, but the Asian region into two blocks. And this is virtually what they've done to some extent, the Americans in South America. Because Lula, etc., in Brazil, don't want, Lula is the world's greatest trade union leader, right? I mean, John Sweeney was a baby compared to Lula, all right? He doesn't want labor standards in a trade treaty. He's been absolutely adamant about that, and so on. So there we have not a very exciting trade-wise initiative on the for FTAA led by Brazil. On the other hand, we've got the US, Mexico, NAFTA, and Andean Common Market countries, which really would roll along with whatever US wants. So we've got two blocks, as it were, one gigantic but not very interested in trade as such, you know, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay. And then you've got the Andean Common Market, which is on the US, you know, the model which TPP is kind of perfecting, you know. So you've already divided that continent into two. You're likely to, not that anyone wants to do it, but that's the way it's developing, and I'm just diagnosing. And that's what you will likely get here, unless you say that that Australians, I think, could play a role in saying we will allow open regionalism in the following sense. That if anybody wants to sign on to all these 50 different things, or 100, I don't know, it'll probably be 200 if you remember the structural impediments initiative with Japan, that required 256 agreements on how hard you worked and all sorts of things and so on. So anything can happen once the lobbyists get to work, right? They can just put their oar into the water in the US system. You just capture USTR and you're in a trade negotiation. So that, I think, is something where you could say, if Australia wants to buy every bit of this rubbish, I mean, sorry, in inverted commas, you know, other than trade, fine, that's your country, your choice, right? I mean, you're happy to do that. But if other countries don't want that, they should be able to sign on and join just because they're willing to negotiate the trade part, right? Open up the rice market, do all sorts of things, right, which are trade liberalization. So that is something which would prevent this splitting of the Asia into two blocks, which otherwise is inevitable. And you, in the end, you don't want two gigantic countries in the region, which US itself is very, very interested in cultivating as a market. You don't want those to be outside of TPP. So it's just like I say, you know, if I want to join a golf club, I don't see, I couldn't possibly derive pleasure from putting little balls into little holes, but you know, there's no accounting for taste. And so if I wanted to join a golf club, okay, then I should know something about playing golf, right? But if to join the club, I have to sing madrigals on Sunday with the rest of the guys and do all sorts of things, you know, wear a tie, do 50 other things. That's ridiculous, right? I should just be able to play golf. So I'm saying we should be allowed to enter from outside in this region the TPP. And Australia can say, look, that is how it should be. If you want to sign on to any other things, go ahead. It's your freedom. It's just your own judgment as to what you want. But don't make that a precondition. If you do that, then you're inevitably going to be in the middle, with Ross Garnaut, etc., pointing towards China, other people pointing towards the US, when in fact you should be pointing towards both. Thank you.
We've now reached the out of probability parameter of the half an hour speech, because we're 40 minutes along. So Professor Bhagwati has agreed to take questions from the audience. And since this is such an intelligent audience, and since he's been giving university presentations for so long, I'll let him share his other questions.
Right, lovely. Lovely. Yeah.
A comment on Australia. I mean, Australia is virtually a unilateral free trade country.
It is.
So as far as I can see, the only thing we get from the TPP is the trade restricting parts. We get monopoly IP way beyond any possible justification. We get all sorts of restrictions.
Demands on you, yeah.
And so I thought I put it more strong. I mean, this is just a bad agreement which Australia should have no part of. And we saw that with the free trade agreement. We've got nothing in terms of actual access to US markets, let alone influence over US domestic policy. But we had to accept a whole bunch of monopoly provisions inserted by the US laws.
But you do have an FTA with the United States, don't you? And then you fought over healthcare, etc. I do. I mean, I've been following you in that way. So you have actually access to the US market. So that's not a compelling reason. I think you're going along with it partly with a view to, well, I mean, it's a politics, the logic. I mean, if the Americans want it, it's very hard for you also to say no outright. So I think what you can do is give a modified no, namely, let it be, we'll sign. I'm 100% sure from what I heard in Canberra that you won't sign on to WTO plus IP provisions. And that is consistent with economics and law, but it is something where you do feel that you're going to be affected badly. But you may want to sign on to other things, you see, as a gesture of goodwill to the United States, because the US really wants to get back into the region. And it is an ally. I mean, I and my wife have voted with our feet. We think it's the greatest country in the world. But it's also got enormous problems which come from the constituency nature of the thing. So I think what you want to do is to protect yourself. Now, if a country doesn't have an FTA, like Singapore when it was discussing it, I said, go ahead and lie in every bed you can because you're completely open. So there'll be no possibility of trade diversion by giving preferences to anybody. All right? You'll just be buying at the lowest cost elsewhere. But you get access to foreign markets. So I said, go ahead and do it. Chile has been doing that, basically acting promiscuously everywhere. So if you have no external tariff barriers, it's a great thing to join FTAs, to tell you the truth, if you're a small country, right? Meaning you're not setting world trade policy, right? So I would give a different advice to US, which of course will not listen to it, but still. So I think that's the answer. I would say stay in the game, but make sure you don't sign on to everything, and make sure that new entrants don't have to, because you have no interest in confronting China. Nor has anybody in the region. And because it's an 800-pound gorilla, and I mean, I don't know how to handle it. I mean, even if you gave it a number of Jessica Langs, it's not going to be satisfying.
But on that very point, I would have guessed there'd be many in the US who saw it in their strategic interests to isolate China, to create two blocks in Asia, one of which is US aligned and the rest being China aligned.
You think that may be a direct objective?
I think that's a strategic objective. It's hard to imagine they're actually making a separate state. I think there are many who would like to see China contained in that very way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. Certainly China is treating it like that. This is why they were acting tough with Singapore when we were there, because that's one of the smaller countries that they can try and intimidate. But it's difficult to tell. I mean, I see it as being probably more a matter of just U.S. developing a presence in the region and taking advantage of the fact. Because I think even the U.S. is not really interested in confronting China. Containing China, but it's hardly like, I mean, is it really serious that these countries could contain China? I don't think so. It's just, China could be contained only by big countries like India and Japan, but neither has an interest in doing so, because it is a tough issue. So I think Kurt Campbell, who must be a good man, he's a state, and he's got to be good because he's married to Lael Brainerd, who's one of our so he must be listening to good advice at breakfast table. So he couldn't be doing something utterly wild, like wanting to contain China in this way. And, there's also a Jacob effect in the sense that if you try and give the impression you're trying to contain it, and it has so much soft power right now, it's building up hard power, it could lead to a Jacob effect in the short run. So I think it's a tricky thing. I hope you're wrong. I can't say you are wrong, no. Yeah.
Professor, in the past you've advocated a world migration organisation. Do you still think that would be useful?
Yeah, I had in mind simply the following, namely that you ultimately protecting your border is it's just something that's how you define your country usually. There are little, we made some dents in that a little bit, but essentially if you try and have an organization which tells you what rules you should accept in letting in people, it's not going to work. So I had in mind essentially something like what the Development Assistance Committee does at the OECD, which is to just take every country that's giving aid and just write down an objective report on, what's the share of loans as against grants, what are the terms and conditions, do you have time, trying to work out good practices, bad practices, but just put it out and then let what I call the Dracula effect work, namely expose evil to sunshine, it will shrivel up and die. That's partly optimistic thinking, because Dracula still survives. So I think and then the same thing happens for 2 years I was advisor to Arthur Dunkel, 91 to 93, so I was put in charge of the trade policy review mechanism. So there we used to have 6 countries basically looked at in terms of their entire trade policy. So, and that meant an impartial review of everything. So like with the European Union, which came in twice in about 6 years, we pointed out what their common agricultural policy was doing to their welfare, right, and so on. So that is a way of supplying that information in a relatively impartial basis, and my hope was that that would start out. So we are not compelling anybody to do anything, because that's too optimistic as of now. But we set up an agency which essentially does this kind of analysis, and thereby we tend to find out, what someone else is doing. And the United States generally is the best country for, maybe Australia's caught up with it. But that compared to, say, Japan. I mean, Japan I was once some years ago, and they were talking about what a massive invasion of illegal people they had. It turned out that about 250 people who had come in from Bangladesh had just disappeared, and that was a great crisis. Now, clearly if the Japanese NGOs and people could see what the United States does and so on and so forth, that could empower them, into saying, look, here is an impartial analysis which will really work. And so I think that was the sense behind it, and that over time it would evolve. But so far it's been lying dormant, but increasingly people are. Now there's so many illegal people. I mean, there are 2 sets of illegal, 3 actually. One is people who cross the border, like at Rio Grande in Mexico. They're actually illegally crossing. Then you've got people like from Bangladesh and Afghanistan and so on, who come in legally and stay on illegally. They just disappear into the country. And the third is, of course, asylum problems, because it's misuse of asylum. We never had it in America because we could do the other 2. And the Europeans had a lot of false asylum cases, and we are kind of catching up with them. You remember DSK getting into trouble with this maid in Sofitel? We are staying at this Sofitel, and I assured the receptionist that, well, I was an economist, I was a different kind. And I spoke no French anyway. So And that was, in my view, an asylum thing, because this poor maid had come in seeking asylum and getting it, because today, from about 5 years ago, we've allowed women who come in alleging rape, and particularly gang rape, to come in, right? It's just a very easy way to get in. So this woman had obviously done whatever the lawyer had said and signed on to all of these charges. And then suddenly she's attacked by DSK. I was reading the accounts carefully, since I'm an expert on so-called on migration and so on. She never called the police. She went quietly, because that's what she's not going to draw attention to herself. Having been raped, she just goes and does another room, comes back and does this room. Then she's sitting outside in the corridor crying. And it's the other maids who reported her. And then she was hysterical when she was interviewed by the prosecution. Because she knew that her whole life in America was at stake. So this is my take on the asylum issue. And that's a very tricky one, actually, because you have to distinguish between real asylum issues and the not. But fortunately, as the other two parts, increase, like even in Europe now, the people coming by boat from Africa, and the whole Middle East migration and so on. So the two systems are converging to some extent, but that is a third route. But all of these things we need to really kind of systematize and report on, and so on and so forth. And I think to have these impartial reports would be fantastic. So I'm in favor of it, but not say what you ought to do. Because if you say what you ought to do, you fail before you start. Nobody will accept it, that I know of. Yeah.
Professor, you mentioned that WTO is dead, and quite clearly it is. What's required to bring it from the morgue back to the emergency room? What can Australia do to help?
Yeah, I know that's something I haven't really given much thought to, in the sense that it's clearly the next thing we want to worry about. All I know is that we've damaged the WTO, because if some element of the Catholic doctrine, is shot dead, then you can't pretend the Vatican won't be affected. So the WTO is affected, and the fact that you can't have multilateral trade negotiations anymore that one can see, maybe we might be able to bring it back. And Australia certainly is very deeply committed to the multilateral system, despite all that's happened. It seems to me that if we could somehow, the fact that the MTN, multilateral trade negotiations, are gone, also affects two other legs, as I've written recently, because the rulemaking now will be in the bilaterals and regionals, which means virtually, since none of the developing countries, when they have these agreements among each other, they don't go into all these other things, but like anti-dumping, subsidy code, a variety of things, which we negotiate as part of the Doha round, Uruguay round, and so on. And now they'll be negotiated virtually by the United States lobbies, working with smaller countries, or which don't have that much clout or interest, and that will then bias the way the rules are created. And I don't want to bore you with details on that, because there are some things which I could point out which are not quite kosher. And finally, a lot of the disputes could be settled just bilaterally, in my view, as we have more of the, and that means you're undermining the multilateral dispute settlement mechanism, which is a very big thing. Now, so there are real dangers to the WTO which we'll have to face up to and try and bottle up. But should we then start for another MTN? Because people are already discussing other ways of doing things aside from the regionals, and one is just going sectoral. And so you just have a service agreement. But there too, if you look at, I don't know, other people from services sector, well, probably banks and so on, But if you look at what the services sector lobby is doing in Washington and, you know, running the show, you'll be surprised that with all this that has happened in the financial sector, they're still the leaders in the financial sector liberalization because they have the money to give to this lobby. So if you say, look, are we going to have international trade in medical services and so on? That's not something you'll see there at all. So, I mean, they're not looking at things where there might be genuine benefits from for people. So I was telling Mike Moore, our New Zealand Prime Minister, who was head of the WTO and is now an ambassador in Washington, and he was just talking about services sector negotiation. I said, Mike, be careful, because if the bulk of what you're going to ask for is financial sector liberalization, you're going to get masses of people in the streets going against you. So at least start with non-financial, right? Because that's where there's at least some presumption that things are going to be better, like in the liberalization of the non-financial sector. Like a lot of the technical change and productivity change is in retail sector. So if you want to, you know, I mean, those are the kinds of things, DHL, whatever, you know, FedEx, retail stores, where you can have mail order, you know, delivery. So our friend Dale Jorgensen at Harvard has been measuring productivity change in several sectors, and believe it or not, retailing is the most productive, not manufacturing or anything like that. And that's because they've adopted these new technologies, you see, on a massive scale. And now it's beginning to happen probably in manufacturers, which is why there was a little revival in the United States. So I think my view is that essentially look at service sector thing also in the, you know, in the eye. Because if you really want non-financial sector, non-financial service sector to liberalize, which seems reasonable, because after all that is part of international trade and should increasingly be liberalized. If you mix it up with the financial sector, I mean, that's like putting a little arsenic into your Shiraz. That doesn't make much sense right now. Anyway, that's my only caveat. Okay, so I think, did I drop something? No. I dropped a brick, probably.
Yes, that could be it. That could be it. You could have dropped a brick. Now we come to the time of the afternoon where we talk about the traditions of the Economic Society. Firstly, though, I'd like to thank the people who brought Professor Bhagwati to us today, the ANU Crawford School, the University of Queensland, which were enormously helpful in supporting this presentation, and of course the Central Council of the Economic Society of Australia. The Economic Society was founded back in 1926, but our traditions go back much further. And one of the traditions that we've always upheld was that of a group of far-sighted central bankers who in 1805 attempted to establish Australia's first independent currency, in which for the very first time an Australian currency, not a British currency, could be exchanged for all goods and services in this country. Unfortunately, this was suppressed by the British government as the Rum Rebellion, but we try and keep alive this tradition through payment in alcohol. So, Professor Bhagwati, please accept our thanks, our applause, and this bottle of fine Australian wine. Thank you.
Thank you so much.